I was 22 years old when I attended what turned out to be my last Halloween party at my former best friend Brian's house. Brian was the kind of guy who lived for Halloween. He was always the one throwing the biggest, most over the top parties, with decorations that looked like they belonged in a horror movie rather than a suburban house. Sadly, Brian passed away from a drug overdose in 2013, but this story takes place a couple of years before that tragic event. Every year, Brian's parents would head to New York for their own Halloween festivities, leaving him free to turn their home into a haunted house for the night. And Brian spared no expense. The house was always decked out in the most terrifying decorations, bloody mannequins, flickering strobe lights, and walls covered in cobwebs. One year, he even built a haunted maze out of cardboard walls, complete with a sound system that blasted eerie noises. The whole setup was both impressive and unsettling. I'll spare you the details about the drugs and alcohol that were consumed that night. We weren't exactly in the clearest state of mind, but that was part of the experience. Brian, along with our friends Tony, Mike, and Jake, were all up in his room, getting high and listening to music, when suddenly we heard two loud bangs from downstairs. At first, we thought it might be part of the party, maybe someone set off fireworks or something. But then we heard screams, loud and frantic, and they were coming from both guys and girls. Brian, who was normally the life of the party, suddenly looked panicked. He rushed to the door to see what was going on, but as soon as he opened it, he quickly slammed it shut again, his face as white as a ghost. "Get down," he whispered urgently. The fear in his voice was enough to snap all of us out of our daze. Without a word, we'd all scrambled to hide. Brian hit the lights and dove into the closet with Mike. I slid under the bed with Tony, and Jake squeezed himself into the storage box at the foot of the bed. The room was silent except for our heavy breathing. Downstairs, the music abruptly cut off, replaced by the sound of a man shouting for everyone to shut up. A girl let out a terrified scream, followed by another loud bang, and then in silence. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I strained to hear the voices from downstairs, but they were too muffled to make out any words. The sound of heavy boots echoed up the stairs, followed by the creaking of floorboards as someone walked down the hall. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. We all froze, barely daring to breathe as the doorknob rattled. When the intruder found the door locked, they began slamming into it, trying to force it open. The first few attempts failed, but then we heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots. The lock was shattered, and the door swung open. From my vantage point under the bed, I could see the intruder's boots, black, worn, and covered in mud. They slowly made their way across the room, heading straight for the closet. I held my breath as I heard the closet door creak open, followed by Brian's voice, trembling as he begged the intruder not to kill him. He offered them money, pleaded with them to take whatever they wanted, but it was no use. The intruder pulled Brian out of the closet and ordered him downstairs. Mike must have hidden himself well, because he stayed behind, undetected. For what felt like an eternity, the three of us remained hidden, too terrified to move. Downstairs, we could hear Brian talking to the intruders, but his voice was too low to make out any details. Finally, after what must have been at least 20 minutes, the front door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. We waited a few more agonizing minutes before Brian came running back upstairs, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "They're gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reluctantly, we crawled out of our hiding spots and followed Brian downstairs. What I saw in the living room is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Two of our friends, Allison and Gray, were lying on the floor, blood pooling around their heads. They were dead, their lives stolen in an instant by a group of masked intruders. The police arrived soon after, but even with the house reeking of marijuana and alcohol, they were more focused on finding out who had committed the murders. Brian told the officers that there were 4 intruders in total, all wearing fedoras, masks like those from the movie V for Vendetta, long coats, and gloves. They had demanded $100,000 in cash, but when Brian couldn't provide it, they forced him to fill their sack with anything valuable they could find. They even made the partygoers empty their wallets into the sack, threatening to shoot anyone who resisted. After that night, Brian was never the same. The The guilt of what had happened weighed heavily on him. He started drinking more, eventually becoming an alcoholic. He stopped going to school and dropped out, turning to harder drugs like meth and heroin. I had one serious conversation with him after the incident. He was sitting on the floor of his room, a pipe in his hand, tears streaming down his face. He told me he couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible for the deaths of Allison and Greg. Brian died of a heroin overdose in July of 2013, not even a year after that horrific Halloween party. I still think about him, about how that one night changed everything for him and for all of us. It was my first Halloween living on my own. I had just moved into a small corner house in a quiet neighborhood. The house was cozy, with a basement but no upstairs, and my parents had helped me buy it by covering half the cost. It was the kind of place that felt safe, a place where nothing bad could happen, but that illusion was shattered on Halloween night. It was around 11:00 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, enjoying a scary movie marathon, when I heard a knock at the door. I paused, wondering who could be knocking so late. Surely, there were no more trick-or-treaters out at that hour. I figured it must be some late-night pranksters playing ding-dong ditch, so I ignored it and continued watching my movie. But then the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Annoyed, I got up and peeked through the window, expecting to catch a glimpse of some kids running off, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the street was deserted. I opened the door and stepped outside, scanning the bushes and the shadows, but saw nothing. Frustrated, I went back inside, double-locked the door, and returned to my movie. I tried to forget about it, convincing myself it was just some kids messing around. But as I sat there, the knocking started again, this time louder and more persistent. It wasn't playful anymore. It was angry, demanding. I was fed up. I stormed to the door, yanked it open, and shouted, "Get lost!" But again, there was no one there. The knocking continued, now pounding against the wood, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. Whoever it was, they weren't going to give up. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops, but something stopped me. If I called the police, I figured it would just escalate the situation. Whoever was doing this might come back later to egg my house or worse. I decided to ignore it, hoping they would get bored and move on. I went to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, and tried to drown out the noise with the TV. But even with the volume up, I could still hear the relentless pounding. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my nerves on edge. Finally, after what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. I let out a sigh of relief and closed my eyes, hoping to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I was jolted awake by a different sound, the sound of knocking. But this time it was coming from my bedroom door. My heart stopped. This wasn't some prank. Someone was inside my house. I jumped out of bed, frantically searching for something to use as a weapon. The door rattled as the intruder tried the knob, then started slamming against it, trying to break it down. I was terrified, convinced that I was about to come face to face with a killer. In a moment of desperation, I came up with a plan. I grabbed my phone, turned on my speaker system, and pulled up a YouTube video of gunshot sound effects. I cranked up the volume and hit play. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the house, loud and realistic. I paused the video and shouted, "That was a warning shot. Leave now, or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head." For a moment, there was silence, and I held my breath, praying that it would work. Then I heard footsteps, 2 sets, stomping across the wood floors and out the front door. I waited a few seconds before opening my bedroom door and peeking out. The intruders were gone, but the front door was wide open. I slammed it shut, locked it, and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the house and the surrounding area but found no sign of the intruders. They told me I was lucky to have scared them off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they would come back. That night, I didn't sleep at all, and for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the fear that they were still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I've never been much of a Halloween person. Growing up, I didn't have many friends, so trick-or-treating was something I did with my mom until I was about 10. After that, I didn't have an excuse to go anymore, and without friends to join me, Halloween just became another night. Last year, I was 14 and my little sister Lily was 8. My mom took Lily trick-or-treating while I stayed home to hand out candy. My best friend Jake had plans with his own family, so I was on my own, but I didn't mind. It felt nice to have a job to do, something that made me feel useful. My mom and Lily left around 6 o'clock p.m., and I settled in on the couch, watching a scary movie marathon on TV. The doorbell rang every few minutes as kids came by for candy, and I dutifully handed out treats, enjoying the festive atmosphere. But then the phone rang, startling me with its loud ringer. I picked it up, but there was no one on the other end. I could hear faint noises, like someone fumbling with the phone, but no voice. After saying hello a few times, I hung up, figuring it was just a prank. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. The same number appeared on the caller ID, but this time, when I picked up, I could hear faint breathing on the other end. "Jake, I know it's you," I said, convinced my friend was messing with me. The line went dead, and I hung up, a little uneasy, but trying not to let it bother me. The doorbell rang less frequently as the night went on, and the streets grew quieter. I was halfway through Friday the 13th when the phone rang again. My stomach twisted in a knot as I stared at the number on the caller ID. It was the same one. I didn't want to pick up, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. Silence greeted me, except for the faint sound of breathing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the voice on the other end spoke, deep and menacing. "I'm coming to see you tonight." I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, probably Jake messing with me, but something about the voice didn't feel right. It didn't sound like him. About half an hour later, the lights in the house suddenly went out. The TV shut off, and the room was plunged into darkness. I stood there frozen as a loud thumping sound came from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, panicking as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Then, through the darkness, I heard laughter, familiar laughter. I opened the door, and there he was, Jake, laughing so hard he could barely stand. "You scared the hell out of me," I shouted, shoving him playfully, but I was more relieved than angry. "I didn't think you'd actually fall for it," Jake said between laughs. "You should have seen your face." "That wasn't funny," I said, still trying to calm my racing heart. "What's wrong with you?" Jake looked at me, confused. "I didn't say anything. I just called and breathed into the phone to mess with you." My blood ran cold. "But the voice, you said you were coming to see me." Jake shook his head. "I didn't say anything, I swear." I felt a wave of fear wash over me as I realized that whoever had called wasn't Jake. We went outside to check the fuse box and found that the wires had been cut. Jake's prank had taken a dark turn, and now we were both terrified. We ran back inside and called my mom, who told us to stay put while she called the police. When the officers arrived, they traced the call to a payphone outside a nearby bar, but they couldn't find out who had made it. We never found out who it was, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that it was more than just a prank, that someone was planning to do something far worse. When I was younger, Halloween was always a big deal for me and my friends. We would spend weeks planning our costumes, mapping out the best trick-or-treating routes, and daring each other to go to the creepiest houses in the neighborhood. But there's one Halloween that stands out from the rest, a night that still gives me chills when I think about it. We were about 12 years old at the time, and it was the first year we were allowed to go trick-or-treating without our parents. We felt like we were on top of the world, free to roam the streets and collect as much candy as we could carry. The night started out like any other Halloween, laughing, running from house to house, trying to hit as many as possible before the night was over. But then we saw him, a man standing on the sidewalk, wearing a long black coat and a white mask that covered his entire face. He was holding a lantern, its dim light casting eerie shadows across the ground. As we passed him, he turned to face us, following us with his eyes. It was creepy, but we shrugged it off. After all, it was Halloween. People dressed up and did weird things all the time. But as we continued down the street, we kept seeing him. No matter which direction we went, he was always there, standing just a little too close for comfort. It was like he was following us, but he never said a word, never made a move. He just watched us, his masked face expressionless, his lantern swinging slightly in his hand. We tried to lose him, running through backyards, cutting through alleys, but no matter what we did, he was always there. Finally, after what felt like hours, we knocked on the door of a house, desperate to get away from him. When the homeowner answered, we blurted out what was happening, pointing down the street to where the man was still standing. The homeowner stepped outside, narrowing his eyes as he looked down the road. The man in the mask started walking away, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't see him again that night, but the homeowner told us to be careful and offered to call the police. We declined, wanting to get home as quickly as possible. Later that night, we found out that one of our friend's parents had seen the same man earlier in the evening. He had been hiding behind a tree, waving at little kids as they walked by. When our friend's dad threatened to call the police, the man ran off, vanishing into the night. We never found out who he was or what he was planning, but the memory of that masked man still haunts me to this day. I was trick-or-treating with my best friend, Kelly, when we were 11 years old. It was one of those perfect Halloween nights, clear skies, a full moon, and just the right amount of chill in the air. We were having the time of our lives, our bags getting heavier with every house we visited. As we made our way across a small wooden bridge over a creek known as Winkle River, a black Jeep suddenly pulled up on the other side, blocking our path. We froze, unsure of what to do. The windows rolled down, and a man with a raspy, smoker's voice called out to us, asking for directions. "We're lost," he said, his voice gravelly and strained. "Can you help us out?" Something about the way he spoke sent a shiver down my spine. Kelly and I exchanged a glance, and without a word, we turned and started walking away as quickly as we could. The Jeep couldn't cross the narrow bridge, so we thought we were safe. But as we reached the end of the bridge, we heard the engine roar to life, and the Jeep sped off down the road. We were just starting to feel relieved when we saw headlights coming around the corner. An SUV barreled toward us, screeching to a halt just a few feet away. The windows rolled down, and inside were three men, one in the driver's seat, one in the passenger seat, and an older man with gray hair in the back. The older man leaned out the window, his raspy voice matching the one we had heard earlier. "Hey, we got free candy in here," he said, grinning at us. "Come on, get in the car." We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran as fast as we could, the Jeep revving its engine as it started after us. My house was just a few blocks away, and I could see it in the distance, but the fear that we wouldn't make it in time was overwhelming. As we rounded the corner onto my street, the Jeep suddenly sped past us, coming to a screeching halt in front of my house. The doors flew open, and the two men from the SUV stepped out, lunging toward us. We dropped our bags of candy and bolted for the front door, frantically ringing the doorbell over and over. My mom opened the door just as the men were closing in. She pulled us inside and slammed the door, locking it behind her. The men backed off, getting into the Jeep and speeding away as my mom called the police. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, as I tried to explain what had happened. The police arrived quickly and took down our descriptions of the men and the vehicle. They promised to keep an eye out, and my mom stayed up all night, worried that the men might come back. But the most terrifying moment came a few hours later when the police knocked on our door to tell us they had caught the men. The Jeep had been pulled over not far from our house, and inside were the three men, now in handcuffs. My dad went outside to speak with the officers, and when he came back, he told us that the men had been planning to kidnap us. The thought of what could have happened if we hadn't made it to the house in time still haunts me. It was the scariest night of my life, but I'm just glad we got away. This happened on Halloween night a few years ago. I took my 7-year-old daughter, Emma, trick-or-treating for a few hours before we came home. We had a great time. She was dressed as a little witch, and she had collected a ton of candy. After we got back, I made dinner, and we watched some TV together before I sent her to bed. Not long after she went to her room, Emma came back looking scared. "There's someone in my closet," she said, her voice trembling. I assured her that there was no one there and that she was safe, but she insisted, asking if she could sleep with me. I didn't want to encourage her fear, so I told her to go back to her room and that I would check on her in a little while. A few minutes later, she was back, this time even more frightened. "I heard something moving in there," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard things falling over." Now I was starting to get a little concerned. I grabbed a flashlight and walked with her to her room. I turned on the light, trying to keep things lighthearted. "See?" I said, opening the closet door. "There's no one in here." But as we stood there in the silence, we both heard it. A thud from inside the closet. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of fear. I told Emma to run to the neighbor's house and call the police, and she took off down the hallway. I yanked the closet door open, expecting to find nothing. But there, sitting on top of Emma's toy chest, was the neighbor's teenage son, Ryan. I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and dragged him out of the closet, furious. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I demanded, but he just stared at the floor, too scared to answer. I marched him next door to his house, where Emma was already ringing the doorbell. When Ryan's dad opened the door, I shoved him inside, explaining what had happened. Ryan's dad was livid. He slapped Ryan across the face, then turned to me, apologizing profusely. He asked me to come inside so Ryan could explain himself, and reluctantly, I agreed. As it turned out, Ryan and his friend Kyle had snuck into our house while I was out with Emma, planning to play a prank. They had crawled in through an open window and hidden in Emma's closet, not realizing how far they were taking things. When I asked if Kyle was still in the house, Ryan nodded and I told Emma to stay with Ryan's dad while I went back to check. Sure enough, there was Kyle, crouched in the corner of Emma's closet, holding one of her stuffed animals. The sight of him sent a wave of anger through me, and before I knew it, I had him by the throat, shoving him to the floor. I slapped him a few times, then told him to get the hell out of my house. I didn't call the police, partly because I was friends with Ryan's dad and partly because I didn't want to drag Emma through the ordeal. But I made it clear that if they ever came near my daughter again, I wouldn't hesitate to make them regret it. After that night, Emma was too scared to sleep in her own room, so she stayed with me for a while. The next morning, I found a small hole drilled into the closet door. Ryan and Kyle had been spying on Emma, watching her as she changed clothes and played in her room. The thought of what they were planning to do still makes my blood boil. In hindsight, I probably should have called the police, but nothing has happened since. And I don't want to stir up more trouble. Emma is 13 now, and Ryan has gone off to college. But I still can't shake the feeling that I let those boys get away with something they shouldn't have, and I regret not taking a stronger stand to protect my daughter. My family and I had just moved into a large new house in Mississauga, Ontario, in an area called Winston Churchill. It was Halloween night, and we were busy unpacking our things and settling into our new home. My parents, my 4 sisters, my brother, and I were all exhausted from the move, but we were also excited about starting this new chapter in our lives. It was getting late, around 11:30 p.m., well after the trick-or-treaters had gone home. My mom had just called us to do some chores, and even though we were all tired, we knew we had to get things done. I was finishing up in my room when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was one of my siblings, so I got up to tell them to stop bothering me. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, and the house was eerily quiet. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was just hearing things, and went back to my room. A few minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, more distinct, as if someone was walking right outside my door. I jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs, where my parents and siblings were still working. "Did any of you just go upstairs?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. They all looked at me, confused, and shook their heads. No one had been upstairs, and now I was starting to feel a little freaked out. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired and hearing things that weren't there. But when I went back to my room, the temperature had dropped significantly. It was freezing, and I had to put on a sweater just to stay warm. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. But then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. A loud banging sound, coming from my parents' bedroom down the hall. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was rhythmic, almost like someone was pounding on the wall. At first, I thought it might be one of my siblings, maybe too scared to go to the bathroom alone. But as the banging grew louder, I realized that wasn't the case. I got out of bed, hesitating for a moment before deciding to check it out. I slowly made my way down the dark hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. When I reached my parents' bedroom door, the banging suddenly stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, too scared to open it. I was about to turn back when the door to my own bedroom creaked open behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. "Who's there?" I whispered, but there was no answer. The door creaked again, and I saw it, just a shadow at first, but then it moved, slowly, as if it were coming closer. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure take shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and as it drew closer, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was standing right next to my bed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure loomed over me, its presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating darkness. And then, in a voice that was low and menacing, it whispered, "Woo." That was all it took. I let out a blood-curdling scream and bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached my parents' room. I threw the door open and flicked on the light, my heart racing as I looked around. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, nothing. My parents rushed to my side, asking what was wrong. I told them everything, the footsteps, the banging, the figure standing by my bed. But they just looked at me, confused and concerned. They hadn't heard anything, and neither had my siblings. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just my imagination, that I was tired from the move and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. My family eventually stopped talking about it, brushing it off as a weird coincidence or a case of an overactive imagination. But I know the truth. I know that something was in that house with us that night, something that I'll never forget. It was a few years ago, on Halloween night. My friends and I were all 20 years old. Right at that age where going to haunted house attractions was one of the best things to do on Halloween. We had heard about a place called Terror Manor, a haunted house attraction that had gained a reputation for being one of the scariest in the area. It was only open for 4 years, and this was its final year of operation. The attraction was unique. It wasn't your typical guided tour. Instead, it was a group exploration through a maze where the only way out was to find a key hidden somewhere in the basement. Once you found the key, you had to use it to unlock the exit door. It sounded like a blast, so we decided to give it a try. The first room we entered was a living room, complete with a giant open coffin in the center and convincing spider webs covering every corner. The furniture looked antique and dusty, and the floorboards creaked with every step. Bloodstains were splattered across the floor, adding to the eerie atmosphere. We could tell right away that this haunted house was going to be intense. As we moved to the next room, the dining room, things got even creepier. The rooms that followed were dimly lit by lanterns mounted on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move with us. Actors in horrifyingly realistic costumes jumped out at us from behind corners and doors, and even though we knew they were coming, they still managed to scare us every time. The maze was designed to be confusing, with fake doors and dead ends that made it difficult to find our way. We spent what felt like hours wandering through the house, trying to find the door that led to the basement. When we finally did, I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. The basement was pitch black, and the idea of going down there was unnerving, but we had no choice. We descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step echoing loudly in the silence. The darkness was so thick that it felt like it was closing in on us, and we had to feel our way along the walls to avoid bumping into each other. Suddenly, I bumped into someone, and I immediately apologized, thinking it was one of my friends. But when I asked who it was, no one answered. Instead, a hand reached out and placed itself on my shoulder. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I took off running, screaming and laughing at the same time. There was something about the darkness, the unknown, that made the situation both terrifying and exhilarating. We stumbled around in the pitch black, trying to find the key that would lead us out. Eventually, one of my friends found it on a desk in the corner of the room, and we all bolted back upstairs, eager to escape the suffocating darkness. When we reached the exit door, we dropped the key into a small bin, just as instructed. There was a sign that read, "Drop keys here, please." We laughed, relieved to be back in the light, and started walking away from the attraction, joking about how scared we had been. But as we walked further away, we noticed something strange. A figure dressed in a black robe and a bloody pig mask had stepped out of the exit door and was following us. At first, we thought it was just part of the act, maybe an employee trying to give us one last scare. But as we continued walking, the figure kept pace with us, always staying just a few steps behind. We started to get uneasy, wondering if this was really part of the attraction or if something more sinister was going on. We decided to test it. As a joke, we started running, and to our surprise, the figure ran too. We stopped, and so did he. We stood still, and he mirrored our movements. What started as a funny game quickly turned into something much more unsettling. As we got closer to my friend Ethan's house, we began to discuss whether we should lead the figure there. We didn't want to give away where Ethan lived, but the figure had been following us for 5 blocks now, and we were starting to get seriously worried. When we reached Ethan's house, he told us that the front door was broken, so we had to go around to the back. We waved at the figure, trying to play it cool, and made our way to the backyard, shutting the gate behind us, but the figure didn't stop. He opened the gate and started walking toward us, this time much faster. Ethan yelled for his dad, telling him to get his gun. That seemed to get the figure's attention. He slowed down, turning his head to face Ethan. Just then, Ethan's dad burst out of the back door, a pistol in hand, and aimed it at the figure. "Get out of here, or I'll shoot," Ethan's dad shouted, his voice filled with anger. The figure raised his hands and backed away, his voice trembling as he pleaded, "Don't shoot. I'm only 27. Ethan's dad kept the gun trained on him until he was out of sight. We were all shaken, but relieved that the situation had ended without anyone getting hurt. But as we sat down to catch our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We contacted the haunted house attraction the next day to report what had happened, but when we described the figure in the pig mask, they informed us that they had no employee dressed like that. Whoever that person was, they weren't part of the attraction. We'll never know who was behind that mask or what their intentions were, but the experience left us all deeply unsettled. It was a Halloween night that none of us will ever forget. Love creepy stories? Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Our email is in the description. Please send in your horror stories.